Good morning. It is Thursday, November the 15th, and this is The Drill. And thank you very much. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America, because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo. And this is the show that is for the butchers, the bakers, and the candlestick makers, for those people that are not satisfied with Rush Limbaugh, with Sean Hannity, with Hugh Hewitt et al., that recognize that, yes, those individuals mean well, and yes, they're patriotic, and yes, they love their country, but that in and of itself is not enough. That is who this show is for. So how can, one of the popular misconceptions is that conservatives think that they can be a conservative but act like the left. You can't do it. It doesn't work. It's a contradiction. The left likes to get organized. Anytime there's any type of a social problem, they want to get people organized. On the right, we are about the individual, the power of the individual, the responsibility of the individual, and the rights of the individual. That's what differentiates us from the left and makes us worth associating with, and we're a better group of people, et cetera, et cetera. So the question then becomes, of course, well, how can I, quote, make a difference, unquote, as the left likes to put it? I like to say, be effective. How can we be effective as individuals in the face of, let's say, the so-called left-wing media, what I call the news departments, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, etc. Everybody knows who the left news places are, MSNBC, CNBC, and all that. So normally the left would say, boycott, boycott. And a lot of people on the right do the same thing then. They respond the same way. Hey, it worked for the left. It'll work for us too. Problem is that the left has no regard for the individual. They organize because, as far as they're concerned, the group is all that matters. The individual should be subordinated to the group. On the right, we feel and know better. We know better than that. We know that the most important thing is the individual. That without the individual, the group does not exist. So again, here you have a situation of, let's say, newspapers. Let's say I live in Southern California, so it's going to be the Los Angeles Times. And you're furious with the Los Angeles Times because of various editorial positions that they have taken, their attitudes towards conservatives in general. Maybe they've engaged in various lawsuits to get either laws overturned or force people to do things they don't want to do, whatever it is that you're upset with the Times about. Now, your natural inclination here might be to say, hey, boycott. So I'm going to turn in my subscription to the LA Times. I'm going to call them up, cancel my subscription to the Times, and then I'm going to encourage all my friends to do likewise. I would suggest that there's a better way of doing things. Number one, a boycott is a pain in the ass. Let's put it that way, for everybody. It's probably not going to be as big of a pain in the ass for the LA Times unless you can significantly impact their circulation. Unless you know enough people where you can get their circulation to drop by, say, 10%, then they're not going to notice the difference. Okay, so you can get all your friends organized. You're going to work real hard, take time out to get everybody organized to refuse to read the Los Angeles Times, and you're probably even if you can get everybody to cooperate, you're probably going to be rather ineffective. And plus, then now's the question is, where do I get my news? Where do I get my news? So there's that kind of a thing going on. How is it that I can, I need certain things from society. I need news. How do I get it without being a hypocrite? I'm, doing the critical of Los Angeles Times, and there's people on the radio that do it all the time. Will criticize with one side of the mouth, say that it's a rag, it's put the LA Times down every chance they get, and then with the other side of their mouth, they're quoting the very same newspaper. Oh, hey, here's an interesting article in the Los Angeles Times. Excuse me, but 5 minutes ago you were telling us basically that it was a worthless rag and not worth reading. So why are you quoting them now? Because they find themselves stuck. What are we going to do for news? Well, one of the things now, as a broadcaster is concerned, I mean, that's easy. All you have to do is you can find all kinds of other sources for news. There's an Orange County newspaper that's better than the Los Angeles Times. I think it's called the Register, the Orange County Register. And so you can get that. Quote them. Skip the Times and quote them. So much easier for a broadcaster. Now, but you as an individual, let's say you like to go to Starbucks every morning, you want to buy your copy of the Los Angeles Times and read it, or you otherwise, or maybe at home, you have it delivered, and then you are going to sit with your coffee, you're going to read the newspaper, kind of get caught up on what what's going on in the world, in the country, in the state, etc. So now without your LA Times, what are you going to do? Well, again, you could switch newspapers, go, say, to the Orange County Register, but if you don't live in Orange County, then there's going to be some gaps in terms of knowing what's going on in Los Angeles County. So you got a bit of a problem there. What I would suggest is that there's another way to approach this. You don't have to exactly boycott, but you could still be effective and kind of have your cake and eat it too. You can get your news, get it from the Los Angeles Times without having to subscribe and without having to buy the newspaper. There's two basic ways to do it. Number one, go to the library. I know probably most people don't want to be bothered to do that. You're not going to get up in the morning and get your cup of coffee and then schlep to the library to read your newspaper. Probably not going to happen. Here's another way of doing it. It requires a little bit of change in your routine, perhaps, but it's effective. You go to Starbucks. You go to Starbucks to get your coffee, and there's a guy I see at a certain Starbucks in Pasadena that does this on a regular basis. He comes in, and he doesn't even actually buy coffee. He just comes in, and they have the newspapers stacked up. And so he grabs a top copy of, I think it's the New York Times, opens it up, looks at it, thumbs through the pages looking at or for certain things. He doesn't spend very long with it, puts the paper neatly back together the way it was, and then puts it back where he found it, and then leaves. And then he takes off. And I might suggest that's another way to do it. Go to Starbucks, get yourself a free copy, read the newspaper, take a look at it, make sure you put it back neatly, nice and neat, and then put it back on top of the stack, so to speak. You got your news, and you didn't have to pay for it. You're not promoting the Times, but you're still able to get your news, because that's really the quandary you're in. How do I get my news without having to promote a newspaper that really offends me? And that's one way that you can do it. And I'm sure if you put your mind to it, you can find others. My point is, don't bother with the boycotts. I get so tired of hearing that. People left and right are saying, boycott this, boycott that. I have to keep a list. I go to the grocery store. Oh, you shouldn't get Kellogg's because Kellogg's supported, the Palestinians, or they were anti-Trump or whatever. And it's hard to keep track of. And now I can't, that means if I can't buy Kellogg's, that's half the cereals in the aisle I can't purchase. And that's ridiculous. Who's getting punished here? Kellogg's? You think they're really going to notice the fact that I'm not spending $5 a week for their cereal? Or am I getting punished because I've now cut my choices for breakfast cereals in half? Plus, who knows what else cereals, it may not be the only thing Kellogg's is involved in. They may have other types of breakfast foods. They may even be involved with beverages, for all I know. So you may end up drinking something and find out that you're supporting Kellogg's anyhow. But my point is, find a way where you can look for more creative ways other than boycotting the particular company that's being offensive. So in this particular case, what you can also do with somebody like Kellogg's, if they're irritating you, is advocate that people dump the stock. That's going to have a more immediate and profound effect on the company than refusing to have Rice Krispies or whatever it is that Kellogg's produces. Okay, most of the time you want to get the point across to a company, dump their stock. Okay, and advocate to your friends that they do the same. If you have a stockbroker that is handling your 401k, then go to them and say, find out, am I involved in any mutual funds that have Kellogg's in them? And if I do, I want out now. That kind of thing. Much easier. It's one phone call. You don't have to be inconvenienced. You're not punishing yourself. You're really punishing the company. So, when we come back today, I'm going to be covering Ayn Rand, the Ayn Rand lexicon, and then it's going to be we're going to be reading from Breaking Bad and House, the House in Philosophy and Breaking Bad in Philosophy. When I come back. And thank you very much. Welcome back. And from the Ayn Rand lexicon, today's entry is context dropping. Context dropping is one of the chief psychological tools of evasion. In regards to one's desires, there are two major ways of context dropping: the issues of range and of means. A rational man sees his interests in terms of a lifetime and selects his goals accordingly. This does not mean that he has to be omniscient, infallible, or clairvoyant. It means that he does not live his life short range and does not drift like a bum pushed by the spur of the moment. It means that he does not regard any moment as cut off from the context of the rest of his life, and that he allows no conflicts or contradictions between his short-range and long-range interests. He does not become his own destroyer by pursuing a desire today which wipes out all his values tomorrow. A rational man does not indulge in wistful longings for ends divorced from means. He does not hold a desire without knowing or learning and considering the means by which it is to be achieved. Whenever you tear an idea from its context and treat it as though it were a self-sufficient, independent item, you invalidate the thought process involved. If you omit the context, or even a crucial aspect of it, then no matter what you say, it will not be valid. A context dropper forgets or evades any wider context. He stares at only one element and he thinks, I can change just this one point and everything else will remain the same. In fact, everything is interconnected. That one element involves a whole context. And to assess a change in one element, you must see what it means in the whole context. So, for some reason, what I was thinking about is that left likes to do a lot of sloganeering, and one of the things they like to do is, well, sloganeering. So one of the favorite slogans is migrants. More of just a phrase but they're dropping context here. The context of migrants is property. Migrants are people that are moving from place to place without an issue of property. Emigrants and immigrants, that involves property. Those are contextual. For instance, the people that are in Mexico right now that are on their way to the United States are emigrants. They have left their home countries, Honduras, El Salvador, etc., to come to the United States. They have immigrated to Mexico and are looking to immigrate to the United States. And the difference between migration and immigration or emigration is property and property rights. The border delineates our property and separates our property, American property, from other people's property, whether it's Canada or Mexico to the south. So, and for that matter, any other country on Earth. But the closest neighbors that we'd have, of course, would be Canada and Mexico. So, and it drives me crazy to listen to conservatives refer to this caravan of people as migrants. They're not migrants. There's, animals migrate, people emigrate and immigrate. Now, there is such thing as a migrant worker. And a migrant worker is somebody that moves from place to place within a particular state or country looking for work. So, for instance, the people that are picking lettuce or grapes or something of that nature. They're migrant workers because they'll be working at one particular farm or field today, and next week they'll be working somewhere else. So they migrate from job to job. They don't emigrate or immigrate because they're not moving between states. So it's not like they're immigrating or emigrating from Mexico to California. Now, they might be if they're going back and forth from Mexico to California. They get their work done, and they go back to Mexico, and then come back from Mexico back to California to go to work again. Then you're talking an issue of emigration and immigration. Migration does not deal with property. Emigration and immigration does. When I come back, we're going to be reading Breaking Bad in Philosophy, Bad or Living Through Chemistry. Thank you very much. And Breaking Bad, Bad or Living Through Chemistry, and this is it's called Breaking Bad in Philosophy. And the idea of reading these is to demonstrate to people that philosophy is the foundation of all other thinking, all other thought process, whether you're talking about making a television show or you're talking about politics. It is philosophy that is, or culture for that matter. Philosophy is the foundation for all of that. So we were talking about Breaking Bad or Born That Way, and whether or not determinism and that kind of thing, and talking basically about the character Walter White's guilt in terms of people that he has killed or harmed. This section of the chapter is called The Problem of Evil. The context of Augustine's life was considerably different from Walt's. They're referring to Saint Augustine, who was a Roman emperor way back in the 400 AD. For Augustine, God's existence is the one truth that science must bring into agreement with our experiences of evil. As he explains in Book 7 of the Confessions, if God is all things that the Judeo-Christian traditions say that God is, namely all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, then God must have knowledge of evil and possess the power to prevent it. Yet, apparently, God doesn't prevent it. What's even more problematic is the Judeo-Christian claim that God is present in all things and at all times. If this is so, then one must conclude that God himself is in some way corrupt, that evil is part of or mixed with God. This is inconsistent with the notion that God is all good. Throughout the history of philosophy, this set of problems has been collectively referred to as the problem of evil. Excuse me. Walt's own problem of evil is effectively the same, even though it stems from an assumption essentially opposite to that of Augustine. Walter never says that there's no God, but it's implied in the claim that chemistry is, quote, all of life, unquote. From Walt's materialist point of view, no thing is more or less evil than anything else. Evil, fear, guilt, and the like are no more than chemically induced feelings that serve the human organism in its drive towards self-preservation. From this point of view, there's no such thing as free will because, like fear and guilt, will is nothing more than a chemically induced feeling that isn't free at all. Evil is only problematic from this perspective if there is some part of the human organism that functions independently from the laws of chemistry, and, being free from those laws, can genuinely choose evil actions over good ones. St. Augustine answers the problem of evil by arguing that evil and corruption aren't created at all. In fact, evil occurs in destruction, that is, in the undoing of creation. And so, Augustine is able to say without contradiction or heresy that God is present in all of existence because evil exists only where existence is falling apart. What causes this to happen? Corruption of the will. In other words, evil occurs when one chooses or takes actions that lead him away from God, away from goodness, that is, towards destruction. Augustine's analysis of evil is the same as that of the materialists. Both identify goodness with continued existence and self-preservation. Both identify evil in one way or another with self-destruction. And so it would seem that with or without God in the picture, Breaking Bad involves some action leading towards self-destruction. This thought troubles Walt as he considers what to do about Crazy 8. And Crazy 8 is the one of the drug dealers that he and Jesse got in mixed up with, and they ended up capturing Mr. Crazy 8 and basically chaining him up in the basement. And now Walt is trying to consider what it is that they're going to do with Mr. Crazy 8. And so next time it's going to be Requiem for Crazy 8, where they'll go more into, the author will deal more with the issue of evil. But the point here is that, again, we're getting into some deeper stuff. And also, I think from a right-left standpoint, the left doesn't want to talk about evil. They don't want to talk about good. They don't want to talk about evil. As far as they're concerned, that evil and good are just arbitrary constructs. So they don't want to talk about that. What they want to do instead is simply describe behavior. So-and-so did this. So-and-so did that. The lady I was talking about yesterday that drowned 5 of her children in the bathtub, forget what her name is, and they would prefer to say, okay, she drowned X amount of her children in the bathtub. That's what she did, but not attach a value judgment to it. So how do you defeat that? Every day, if you're a conservative, you must be making value judgments. You must be making value statements. That means using the R word and the W word, right and wrong. You're dealing with your children, for instance, and you say, don't slouch at the table. Eat your broccoli. Then you want to make sure that you reinforce, not only for your child, but for yourself, that what you're telling them to do, eat your broccoli because that is what's good for you. That's what's right to do because it's good for you. Let's put it that way. Don't slouch at the table because it's wrong, because it's rude, because it's bad for your posture, and you need your posture is going to help you throughout your life in terms of projecting confidence, et cetera, et cetera. But use the W word, use the R word. And when you hear people, usually again people on the left, but it might be people that actually consider themselves conservative that will avoid using the R or the W word. They get caught up in describing behavior rather than making a value statement or judging the behavior. There's nothing wrong with judging people's behavior as long as you're prepared to admit that you're wrong. In those rare cases where you are wrong, you've misjudged somebody, you simply need to be able to say, I was wrong. This person isn't as good or bad as I initially judged them to be. So remember that judgment is part of life. It's inescapable. So when the left is telling you don't judge, it's like saying don't breathe. It's that much a part of life. So when we come back, I'm going to be reading from House and Philosophy and House. Thank you very much. And both of these books are dealing a lot with ethics. So far, with the Breaking Bad, it's about Walt's behavior in terms of how he, people that he has killed, and to what degree he is culpable or responsible for their deaths. And with House, we're dealing with the same thing. House has a tendency to be very results oriented. He seems to believe that the ends justify the means, might makes right, and so there's an evaluation going on here for whether or not that is right or wrong, and to what degree. So this section of the chapter is called How Much is a Doctor Responsible For? In the Season 3 episode Half-Wit, Foreman suggests a, quote, risky and invasive, unquote, treatment for their patient. And House responds, quote, that's why God invented the long consent form, unquote. While House in general seems to take consent forms lightly, in House training he performs an autopsy before Wilson has gotten the consent form signed. In many other episodes, he bullies the patients or their caregivers into signing consent forms. The problem of moral luck might be a reason for him to take the forms more seriously. Rather than being simply a legal formality, they could be a doctor's best defense against the vagaries of moral luck. The contemporary philosopher Donna Dickinson argues that informed consent ought to be taken seriously on moral and not just legal grounds, as, quote, it is the giving of informed consent that stops the probability machine rolling and that shuts out questions about moral luck and risks for the doctor, unquote. Knowing that some outcomes, statistically speaking, will be negative, the doctor cannot constantly be bracing herself against feelings of guilt or remorse if the outcome for a particular patient is bad. Informed consent, provided it is obtained properly, serves to transfer the burden of the responsibility for ill luck from the doctor to the patient. The patient, given a reasonable understanding of the risks, assumes responsibility for the risks, provided that the doctors do not perform negligently. As Dickinson writes, if a procedure turns out badly, the normally competent physician cannot be held ethically at fault if she has obtained informed consent. To put the matter in deliberately oversimplified terms, she will be unlucky but not evil, and should experience regret but not guilt or remorse. If this is true, then the consent form might indeed seem to be a divine magic bullet. Of course, this puts all the emphasis on the procedure rather than the outcome. House regularly appeals to the results of his actions, saying that as long as they end up working, all will be well. House can be seen either as consequentialist, the outcome of an action is what matters in judging it good or bad, or a paternalist. It is up to the doctor to determine what is in the best interests of the patient, regardless of the patient's own values, or both. As Dickinson points out, the "they'll thank you afterwards" argument can be extremely tempting to clinicians. The problem with this is that if House fails, he's left utterly undefended ethically. And this might not matter to House, but it matters to those around him and to us, the viewers. Overriding consent or the standards of openness involved in gaining consent, even if the recommended treatment seems to be in the best interest of the patient, is problematic not just for violating a standard of care, but also for the problem of resultant luck. Sure, everything is fine if it works, which things usually do for House, but there is no way of knowing for sure that it will. Even though, as Cuddy points out to Foreman in Deception, House gets lucky a lot. It still doesn't alter the risks involved in what he's doing. If the basis for judgment is consequentialist, then bad results mean that the doctor has done something wrong and is blameworthy. Similarly for paternalism. If the results are not in the best interest of the patient, then there is no other defense for them. Dickinson argues that these are both problematic. For her, the correct option is that the doctor's responsibility is not necessarily to get the outcome right, but to proceed in the correct fashion. An absolutist interpretation of consent protects both doctor and patient, the doctor from moral luck and the patient from invasion of autonomy. Of course, the problem with informed consent is what is notoriously tricky to determine what reasonable standards are in disclosing the risks to the patient. In addition to this, what happens if the patient is unable to consent and proxies are either unavailable or illegal, as they are under English law? For example, a patient that Foreman kills in House training has trouble making decisions. The episode opens with her suffering an attack of abulia, inability to decide, generally due to some form of brain damage. And another attack occurs as House is getting her to sign the consent form. Due to the attack, she can't decide whether or not to sign it. After she loses consciousness, House tells the nurses that she will want to sign the consent form as soon as she wakes up. Further, even when House was giving her the list of risks, he quickly changed the subject, asking her why she didn't like Foreman, rather than giving her time to process and consider the risks. This is hardly a case of thoughtful, reasoned consent. We do not see her when she signs the consent form, but it is unlikely that she is in any position to refuse. Might the dubious consent be at all related to Foreman's strong agent regret and even remorse over her death? Had Foreman sought the consent himself, might he feel differently about the outcome, more resigned to it? If the patient had more time to think about the effects of the radiation, more time to discuss it with her doctors, might she have reacted differently to being told of their mistake in her diagnosis? There's a couple of places in here where they used the word wrong. Once these were wrong, and a couple of times where the author used the word correct. Because as I was reading this, I'm thinking, this is fascinating that they're talking about ethics, which when you get right down to it, ethics is about right and wrong, and universal rights and wrongs. What is right or wrong for everybody. Universal meaning everybody, everywhere, at all times. Okay, so murder is a universal wrong. It is wrong to murder. It was wrong 2,000 years ago. It's wrong today. It will be wrong 2,000 years from now. It is wrong for me. It's wrong for you. It's wrong for people in Papua New Guinea, for Australia, the entire planet. So it's wrong for everybody all the time, everywhere. Period. So that's what we're really getting into here. And they're trying to psychologize the issue by talking about feelings. How are people going to feel? Are they going to feel guilty? Are they going to feel? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how they feel. If a person commits murder and they don't feel any guilt or remorse over the action, it isn't any less wrong. The other thing with in dealing with doctors is they already have a code of ethics. Their basic code of ethics is found in what's called the Hippocratic Oath. The number one thing in the Hippocratic Oath is first, do no harm. Okay, so that's the first thing the doctor has to ask. If I'm going to do a certain procedure or whatever, am I likely to harm the patient? And if so, don't do it. You err on the side of caution. As far as consent is concerned, it seems to me it's relatively easy. As it's been explained to me, if you're going to give first aid to somebody and you go to give them first aid, hi, my name's Ron, I know first aid, can I help you? And they say no, F off, then I can't do anything. Now, if this person then loses consciousness, then it is moral and ethical for me to assume that he would have wanted care or needed care. If it's an emergency situation. Of course, if we're talking about somebody that has the flu and they just simply fall asleep, but we're talking about an emergency situation and somebody, let's say they're bleeding profusely, but they're telling me, no, I don't want any help. I don't want your assistance in any way, shape, or form. And then he passes out from loss of blood. I am permitted and actually morally required to go ahead and give aid to this individual. I can't let them die, despite the fact that they have already told me once that they don't want my help, because it's obvious they need my help, whether they want it or not. And when they lose consciousness, we get to assume that they would have or would be changing their mind were they a conscious, awake, and able to do so. But anyways, like I said, it's interesting in this chapter that they're approaching this from a psychological standpoint rather than approaching the whole issue from a philosophical standpoint, from an ethical standpoint, and asking what are the universals here? Is it universally acceptable? Is it universally, because one of the other things we're getting into with the patients is deception. Is it right to deceive your patient? No, period. So that's another, and it's universally wrong. It was wrong 2,000 years ago. It'll be wrong 2,000 years from now. It's wrong for anywhere on the planet, everybody anywhere on the planet. It's wrong to deceive people, period. Now, you may end up with getting a better result if you deceive somebody, and you may want to say, hey, the ends justify the means, or another way of putting that is all's well that ends well. So long as the patient gets better and is able to live a healthy life, no. Wrong to deceive the patient. Deception is wrong. Maybe entertaining in the case of magic and whatnot, but it's when you're dealing with other people, deception is universally wrong. It's lying, and lying is universally wrong. Okay, so that brings us to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. And until next time, thank you for listening, and have a great day.